California have the good sense to vote against that.
Without raising the taxes, though, how do governors like Governor Schwarzenegger pay for services provided by the state of California?
Well, you know, it's a good point, and this is why our rich states, poor states is worth reading. The reason that California has such a massive deficit right now is that its spending is completely out of control. And here's a state that during the boom years, you know, from 2003 to 2007, its budget went up by 40% in 5 years. And so you just can't sustain those rates of growth of spending. You know, you asked how can California pay for good services. Let's compare California with New Hampshire. Now, New Hampshire has one of the smallest state governments of any state, but a person in New Hampshire pays half in taxes what a person in California pays. And I would submit to you, Rob, that people in New Hampshire have better public services, better schools than in California. So you really have to ask the question of what is the government doing with all the money that it receives?
The American Legislative Exchange Council publishes Rich States, Poor States, and you can also find a link to it on our Washington Journal website. Next up, Tampa on our line for Independence. Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
My question is this. Why do they not give the proper name to what they call conservatism? It's really greed. They find all the necessary words to justify it, but when it comes right down to it, it's just greed.
Why do you say it's greed, sir?
Because if it benefits the rich, it's fantastic for the conservative end. If it helps the poor, the conservatives stand up and fight against it. The main thing is the current one is the health plan. I am retired. I have cancer. My employers cannot afford the insurance once you retire. What do?
Yeah. I think this is, you know, we are at a crossroads in this country, and this gentleman really, I think, you know, brings to head this big debate that we're having in this country. Do we still believe in the free enterprise system, that people who work hard and you know, start a new business or something like that can succeed, or do we want to tear down the people who create the wealth? I mean, one of the problems that I have with all of these higher taxes on the rich and calling them greedy and so on is, look, if you look at the people who are paying these highest tax rates that we're going to be raising in the next couple of years under the Obama program, 2/3 of those people are owners, operators, or investors in small businesses. Though that's where the jobs come from. So when we ask, how are we going to create jobs? I don't know how we're going to create jobs if we're raising taxes on businesses that create jobs. How are we going to create jobs when we have a corporate income tax structure that's 10 or 15 percentage points higher than the rest of the world? It gets back to the point I was making earlier. I want a system where all Americans succeed, where the poor get richer, the middle class get richer, and the rich get richer. But I don't think that's going to happen if we move away from the free enterprise system. And we could see around the world the failure of socialism and the failure of big government policies and high tax rates. Why in the world do we want to emulate what Europe has done, which has been a complete catastrophe?
One of the headlines in the business section of the Times this morning, the New York Times, Treasury is said to tell GM to prepare for possible bankruptcy. Your thoughts on that?
Well, this has been a mess, hasn't it, this car, you know, and we put so much money into the car companies already. And by the way, I had an article in the Wall Street Journal on Friday about the fact that I own a Camaro and what a great car this is. I've always bought an American car. I want the American car industry to succeed. We all do, I think. The question is, can they succeed? And I do think Tim Geithner, I didn't see that story, but if he said that GM and Chrysler should look at the bankruptcy option, unfortunately, I think he's right. And I think, you know, this is the problem I've had with all of these bailouts that we've done for the last 6 months. Bailouts of banks, insurance companies, car companies. I mean, my goodness, even the porn industry has come to Washington saying it wants a bailout. We can't keep bailing out losers and taking money from profitable companies and giving it to unprofitable ones.
Our next call for Stephen Moore comes from Mary in Indianapolis on our line for Democrats. Thanks for waiting.
Thank you. Well, I just don't like this guy. You know, he's just trying to rewrite the whole Reagan era. You know, he was a union busting, double-digit employment, war on the middle class president. And, you know, it's just time for the rich to pay their part. You know, no matter how you want to talk about it, no matter how you want to spin it, it is time for the rich to stand up. We've waited for the compassionate conservatism movement to move down and help communities. Like, oh, we're going to cut the taxes. This is what Bush said. We're going to cut the taxes on the rich, and it's going to trickle down to the poor. Well, guess what? It never trickled down. It didn't trickle down when H.W. Bush was in there. It didn't trickle down when George W. Bush was in there.
Ma'am, before I let you go, let me ask you this. How do you define rich, and how do you define their share?
I define rich, okay, like I'm in the middle class, and I pay about 33% tax on my money. If they want to pay 33% like I do, that would be to me. You know, that would be very fair to me. You know, we're always picking up, the middle class is always picking up the tax burden, always. You know, to where we don't have anything. And I want to say another thing about Ronald Reagan.
Well, let me ask you this. How much money did you make last year? How much did you declare on your taxes?
How much, between me and my husband, was $60,000.
And you paid 33% of that?
Yes, we did.
Okay, thanks.
Well, that's too high. I don't think anybody should have to pay 33% of their income in taxes. I think we should probably, the limit should be about, as I said, 15 to 20%. And look, if you look at what happened from the period in 1980 through last year, which is a 28-year period. In 1980, the richest 1% paid 19% of the income tax. This last year, even though income tax rates have been cut, the richest 1% paid 40%. By the way, the top 10% pay about 70% of the income tax. So it's a highly progressive system. And by the way, the lesson that we've learned throughout history, ma'am, is every time we've cut tax rates on the rich, whether it's capital gains taxes or income taxes or dividend taxes, we've gotten more money from the rich because we've grown the economy. We cannot grow this economy if we're raising taxes on businesses, because businesses is where jobs come from.
We've got an email from Cordy who writes, Mr. Moore, how soon will your prediction of a 30,000 Dow, the title of your earlier book on the stock market, come to pass?
Well, I'm happy to tell you I did not write that book. There is a book called Dow 30,000. I never predicted that, but I would love to see the day. You know, I mean, look, I believe in prosperity. I believe in the American worker. I believe in America. We can be the #1 country in the world just as we were in the 1980s and 90s under Bill Clinton. I think Clinton actually was a good president. We got the budget under control. We cut the corporate capital gains tax rate. We did welfare reform. We've got to get back to the idea of fiscal responsibility, lower tax rates, and keeping government spending under control. But I never predicted Dow 30,000. But I would love to see the day. I'd love to see Dow 100,000. I mean, I want every American to be rich.
In the Financial Times this morning, this headline, China threat to tighten reins on credit. If they do that, how is that going to affect our economy?
That's another good question, Rob, because this is something that we should all be concerned about. I mean, we are in new uncharted territories with the amount of debt that we are issuing. People called in and said, look at the debt that we had under Ronald Reagan. And we've issued more debt in the last 4 months than Ronald Reagan did in 8 years. So this debt that we have now is really frightening. I mean, when you're talking about borrowing $2 trillion in one single year, and you raised the right question, what happens if China stops buying our debt? Because China right now is one of the largest buyers of our debt. I mean, foreign countries own about half of our debt right now. And it's a frightening situation because China's economy isn't doing so well right now. If they pull back on the debt, my fear is that we're going to see, Rob, is an increase in interest rates because the markets have to clear, and the only way you can get people to buy that debt is to raise the interest rate that you pay people to buy it.